She might use the time to lecture us, or ask us stupid questions such as, "Are you ever going to do something like this again?" Of course, there was only one answer to that. After your whipping, you would be put in the corner for a while, as a warning for all the other siblings. The beltings we got off Mom were serious, and usually left us with a sore behind for several days once the initial redness had faded. Sitting down for supper was never easy after a dose, although often we didn't even get chance, as we were sent to bed without, to sleep on our tummies. The spankings were always deserved and helped keep a large family in order, but even when we grew up, I think all us kids had equivocal feelings about them. Discussing them one evening with my eldest sister, she said that it was worse for the girls than us boys. I grew up in Arkansas during the 1990s, and my mother's approach to discipline was extremely conservative. She considered that spanking the offspring was woman's work, and she did it with such regularity, which meant that almost every day, either me or my brothers and sisters, I have two of each, had sore behinds. When we were real little we got Mom's bare hand across our bottoms, but by the time we were older, she stepped us up to the discipline of the belt. This was an old one of Dad's, which she kept exclusively for searing our backsides. Whereas most moms I knew would ask their child rhetorically whether they wanted a spanking when they were naughty, Mom's question was always, "Child, do you want a taste of the leather?" We never did, of course, but that didn't stop Mom applying it. The punishment would be administered in front of all the siblings, so we were all well acquainted with such happenings. The belt was given with the offender in question bending over, hands on knees, their bare backside facing the rest of the family. Mom would come in with the belt, with the child to be whipped usually already in tears. Then would come the order, "Prepare yourself." You would bashfully obey. "Bend over," would be the next thing you would hear. Then you would feel Mom come behind you and the leather being placed against your buttocks, as she got her aim. After that, there was a whoosh and a crack and your entire bottom would be engulfed in a tide of stinging pain. Mom never went easy on us if we had earned the belt, she made sure we got it all right. If you weren't already crying and screaming before, you sure were by then. For most things, you got a good round dozen licks, no matter what your age. Mom took her time, and left a good gap between each lick so the child could really appreciate the sting in each one. For as long as I can remember, I've been fascinated with spanking. I would come up with plans in my head to somehow get a spanking from my mum or grandma, but would never follow through. The most I got was a playful, "I'll smack your bottom for you, young man." I was obsessed with the subject, always asking questions about spanking. One day, I went in the kitchen and Mum was washing the dishes. She was wearing a summer dress, and I admired her for a minute, imaging myself draped over her legs getting some good hard smacks. With this in mind, and hearing Grandma in the past talk about how she used to tan her backside, I asked Mum what it was like to get your bottom smacked, and if she had ever asked for one. She smirked slightly, dried her hands and sat down at a kitchen chair, motioning me to sit at the table with her. "Why do you keep asking about this? Do you want a smacked bottom yourself? Is that what it is?" Mum was a pretty good mind-reader. I went beetroot red and looked down, and she knew right away it wasn't an idle question. To be honest, I didn't really know myself. It's just that, as I say, I'd always had this interest about spanking. It was embarrassing and difficult for me to talk about, but Mum gently coaxed it out of me. Eventually, she said, "Well, maybe a trip over my knee will cure your curiosity and put an end to all those questions. If you still want a smacked bottom, I'll take you into my room after dinner, but I'm warning you it won't be fun, and there will probably be tears. You think about it, sweetheart." She opened her arms for a hug, and as we embraced she patted my bottom. "You're a good boy, but sometimes even good boys need a spanking." She kissed me on the cheek, and sent me on my way with 2 firm smacks to the seat of my trousers. When dinner was over, Mum asked me, very quietly so no one else could hear, if I had changed my mind. I shook my head no, and she got to her feet. She then told the rest of the family she was going to take me upstairs for a spanking. They were to clean up the kitchen, put the dishes in the dishwasher, and she'd let them know when it was okay to come up. Until then, they were to remain downstairs. Mum firmly took my hand and led me upstairs. I stared at her legs as I followed behind. I was both nervous and excited. Up in her room, Mum sat on the bed. She told me quietly but firmly, "You've made your decision, now I'm going to give you a smacked bottom. I'm afraid this is going to hurt, but no matter how much kicking and crying, the spanking will only end when I decide. Do you understand me?" I nodded and she added, "I love you very much. Now, come here to me." She placed me carefully over her knee. Then she began to smack. At first, it was everything I'd imagined and hoped for, and I was enjoying every second of it. The sound of the slaps, the feel of my mum's hand against my bottom, lying over knee with my feet dangling in the air like a naughty little boy. However, it wasn't long before my bottom started to really sting. I winced but Mum carried on regardless. Now my bottom was really starting to burn, and my eyes were filling with tears. The smacks from Mum's now very warm hand continued, and by now I was crying and kicking my feet. I knew it was no use asking her to stop, because I was getting what she promised. The sound of efficient smacking echoed around the room as I cried. To my incredible relief, Mum finally put an end to my punishment. I lay limp over her knee. She told me how proud of me she was of me, and even though my backside was throbbing I was still happy it had happened at last. After a few minutes, she asked, "Are you ready to get up now?" "Yes, Mum." She helped me to my feet, and we cuddled for a while. Then she told me, "If you ever need to be spanked again, all you have to do is ask." I blushed again. I'd had quite enough for the time being. However, that was the first of many trips over my mum's knee over the next few years. My birth mother died when I was just 6 years old, and for the next 3 years it was just me and Dad. Because we had both been through a lot, I guess it's true to say that he indulged me a lot more than I would have normally been. I have a very vague memories of rarely having my bottom smacked by my mum when I was little, and I believe I got smacked by Dad too a couple of times when I was really naughty, but after Mum's death spankings ceased altogether. Then Dad met and married Jean, my stepmother. At the time of their meeting, Jean was deputy head at a private school in the south of England, but on marrying Dad, she gave up her job, as women did at the time, this was the early 60s, to look after us both full-time. For the first 3 months of her moving in, I think Jean went quite easy with me, again knowing what I had been through. However, there was a distinct air of discipline in the house for the first time, and I was told to call her mother. My new stepmom laid down new rules about bedtimes and curfews, and insisting on me doing homework before any recreational activity. Unfortunately, I started to rebel badly against this new regime. I think part of me was testing my stepmom's boundaries. Dad occasionally argued for her to go a bit easier on me, but he was in the first flush of romance and wasn't about to do anything to endanger his new marriage. It all came to a head one Friday evening when instead of coming straight home from school, as I was supposed to, I went back to a friend's house with her to listen to records for a while. When I finally got home, I found my dinner in the oven and my stepmom at around the same temperature. I naturally got the third degree about where I had been, and I admit I was insolent in my responses. Dad looked very uncomfortable at this whole scene. "Well, Joy," Mother concluded, "I think enough is enough. It's high time you had a little discipline put back in your life, and as soon as you have finished eating, we will see about doing just that." "Please, Jean," my father began, but Mother interrupted him. "Derek, we've talked about this. A little bit of discipline will do her no harm, in fact, it will do her a great deal of good. My dad slumped back into silence. My mouth was about as dry as the food as I tried to eat my dinner, and eventually, I had to admit defeat and put my knife and fork down. Finished? Mother inquired. Right, then let's get this over and done with, Joy. Come with me. Mother took me by the hand and led me to my parents' bedroom. My new mum had brought several pieces of her own furniture with her when she moved in, and among these was a chaise longue, which had been placed in the bedroom. Mother placed me at the lower end of this, then went to her wardrobe. When she turned around, to my horror I saw she was holding a school cane. Please, Mother, I blurted out, not the cane. Don't be silly, Joy, millions of children have had the cane and it's done them a great deal of good. But I don't want it. I'm sure you don't, and in future, you will know that there is a simple way to avoid this, and that is to behave yourself. By now, Mother was standing by my side, and she said in a kinder voice, Come along, let's get this over with, shall we? Take down your knickers and turn up your skirt. Please, Mother, Joy, any more nonsense and I will add an extra stroke. I reached up my skirt clumsily and took down my thick blue school knickers. Then I hitched up my grey pleated skirt. Mother pointed to the arm of the chaise and said, Bend over, please. It was the first time I had been bare-bottomed in front of my new mum, and it was even more embarrassing to know that she could clearly see my fanny from the back too. Now then, you will receive 6 of the best. You may cry, but there is to be no screaming or carrying on, is that clear? Yes, Mother. I had to concentrate very hard on this last command as the cane was laid squarely across my bare buttocks for the first stroke. It hurt like nothing I had ever experienced before, and there was a deep, penetrating pain that went right into my bum. Mother gave me my first caning very efficiently and confidently. As I found out later, she had been authorized to use CP at her school and had whacked many a naughty boy or girl, although all these earlier customers were more fortunate than I, in that it was either over trousers for boys or on the seat of their knickers for girls. The only thing to be said in favor of this ordeal was that it was, as Mother had promised me, quickly over with. And as a mother myself today, I still think that's the chief thing to be said in favor of corporal punishment. Once I had been given my caning, I was sent to my room for half an hour, then allowed to rejoin Mother and my dad in the lounge. I was made to say sorry to them both, of course. The caning marked a watershed in my behavior, and far from resenting these punishments, they made me bond closely with my new mother. I can't say I ever enjoyed being punished by her, but whenever she decided I needed another dose of the cane, and these continued until I was around 15, I went meekly as a lamb to be beaten. I read with interest a lot of the comments and remarks on the subject of corporal punishment. Like a lot of people, I too can offer some personal experiences. This is particularly true on the subject of slippering. I attended a mixed school in the 1960s in the UK. Back then most schools still used corporal punishment on a regular basis. It is safe to say that corporal punishment was a normal part of everyday life. It was never excessive, virtually always justified, and for most of the part accepted. At my own school, corporal punishment was always administered on the bottom and never on the hand, possibly for safety reasons. Punishment for the boys was frequently of the corporal variety. The slipper, which in my experience was not a carpet slipper, or a soft canvas shoe, but most commonly a thick-sole plimsoll, was used on the younger pupils and for less serious offenses. For more serious offenses a boy would be caned. I used to press my face into the bedspread, trying to keep from crying and calling out whilst the slippering was administered. I can well remember how each successive whack would sting more and more, whilst the burning of my bottom grew to an almost unbearable level. Afterwards, she would leave me, lying on the bed and usually having a bit of a cry. Once, when Mother had given it me midweek, I can remember how uncomfortable it was sitting on hard classroom chairs the day afterwards. This constant reminder of the recent tanning of my bottom was all part of the punishment. My mother always said that she hadn't done it hard enough if I wasn't still sore the next day. I used to press my face into the bedspread, trying to keep from crying and calling out whilst the slippering was administered. I can well remember how each successive whack would sting more and more, whilst the burning of my bottom grew to an almost unbearable level. Afterwards, she would leave me, lying on the bed and usually having a bit of a cry. Once, when mother had given it me midweek, I can remember how uncomfortable it was sitting on hard classroom chairs the day afterwards. This constant reminder of the recent tanning of my bottom was all part of the punishment. My mother always said that she hadn't done it hard enough if I wasn't still sore the next day. At school, the normal time for pupils to receive corporal punishment was after lessons finished on Fridays. Apart from the immediate doses given after lessons in the classroom, the usual way was for the pupil to be put on report, meaning that it was necessary to attend the relevant teacher's study, head of the various schools lower, middle and upper, into which the school was divided. There was usually a small queue of unhappy-looking people waiting after the final bell at 3:30 p.m., and punishment began at 4 p.m., to allow the other pupils to leave, I think, otherwise crowds would have gathered to listen. If passing the room later, however, as I often had occasion to do, one could usually hear the sound of swishing cane or meaty thwack from a slipper. I particularly enjoyed watching the recipient coming out afterwards, usually rubbing away at his bottom, even more so if it was someone I fancied. Actually, I would try to pass by before they went in, to spot anyone I knew. Seeing a fanciable one, I would then try to catch his eye and grin at him so that later, conveniently returning and passing by at exactly the right moment, I could catch him coming out and attempt to walk along with him, to commiserate and maybe hear the details. The situation at our homes was similar, but probably corporal punishment was in fact more widely used. I can well remember, you can imagine why, a discussion or debate we held on the subject in my fourth form general studies class. To the surprise of our female teacher, the view of the class was overwhelming in favor of the quick option of corporal punishment. To give an indication of its use, we were asked to indicate if we had received any form of corporal punishment at home during the last year. Surprisingly, 2/3 of the class raised their hands, probably 3/4 of the boys and half the girls. A further question, all I can remember, unfortunately, revealed that virtually all were punished on the bottom with some implement, e.g. strap, slipper or cane. Now to be more specific about my own experiences. I was an only child in a middle-class family. My parents weren't particularly strict, but believed in a firm set of principles of behavior. I didn't have any trouble with this, being generally in agreement, and, I think, reasonably well behaved. But if I did transgress and do something contrary to their wishes, and it would usually be something about which I was myself ashamed, I would naturally and inevitably expect to be punished. My mother took responsibility for my punishments, and had the normal range available for the day. I was kept in it, grounded in today's parlance, for a given period, stopped from doing things I wanted to do, had my pocket money withdrawn and so on. In her armory, quite normal for the time, my mother included corporal punishment. Following age-old custom, if my actions deserved it, I would be chastised. This was always administered in a traditional manner, and on the usual place, with comprehensive ritual and formality. I was given a sore bottom. Getting my bottom tanned or receiving a smacked bottom were not common experiences, but neither were they that rare. When I was in trouble at primary school, I was given a traditional spanking. My mother sat on a chair in her bedroom and put me over her knee and smacked my bare bottom until it was hot and stinging. As soon as I reached secondary school, I was deemed too big to go over her knee, but far from too big to receive a sore bottom. I then had to bend over, most often for the slipper. Because I was only beaten when I was thoroughly in trouble, for something for which I needed a salutary lesson, her punishments were not lightly administered. I viewed them with considerable trepidation, and they weren't easily forgotten. However, I would say that on every single occasion that I was beaten, the punishment was fully deserved and appropriate. Every so often, my mother used corporal punishment on me throughout my time at secondary school, right up to my leaving home for university. In my early years at secondary school, when I was in serious trouble and thoroughly deserved to be punished, she would discuss with me what sentence I deserved, and usually, I couldn't disagree that a hiding was appropriate. Having been informed that my fate was to get a severe dose of the slipper, a whacking, or my bottom tanned, she used the terms interchangeably. She would never punish me immediately, but tell me when she would administer it, leaving a good while for me to meditate. Typically, like a school, she would tend to save up my punishment till the end of the school week, and administer it when I got home on Friday afternoon. Like the boys at school, I knew what was coming and had all day to dwell on it. I've always considered one of the more memorable sensations from my school days the feeling of increasing unease, as it got nearer the time for me to go home. I would feel sick in my stomach, weak-kneed, couldn't concentrate, and would need to visit the loo. When I got home, my mother would send me to my bedroom, where I would try to concentrate on my homework, but usually failing, since the anticipation of a whacking always left me in a real state. When my mother tanned me with the slipper, it was actually an old, large tennis shoe of my father's, with a thick rubber sole, kept for the purpose in my wardrobe. She always used her full weight, with the strength of her tennis-trained arm, in applying each stroke. Each was given as hard as she could, while the severity of the tanning was varied by the number of belts given. If mother had determined that I needed a hiding, her punishments were never minor affairs. The slippering was always a serious punishment, never a few whacks for show, but always at least a dozen and usually more. 1963 was a year I still remember. I turned 10 in August. The Dallas Cowboys went on to a great season, and I even saw one of the home games in November. And after Labor Day, my parents found a new babysitter named Monica. With a very busy social schedule, they were often out 2 or even 3 weeks a night at dinner parties, the theater, or the symphony. Mother had used a variety of babysitters, but most of them made little impression until Monica Dobson. She was 16 when mother hired her and the daughter of our local minister. And for the past year, she had worked as the assistant teacher at my Sunday school, supervising 20 attendees. She was also very pretty. Though a mere 5'2", she was extremely curvy, which made her look very grown up in my eyes. The fact that she was in charge of me every Sunday for an hour only added to her appeal. So did her regular habit of keeping order, threatening unruly ones with a spanking. Unfortunately, she was not allowed to make good on her threats. All discipline was administered by the Sunday school director, Mrs. Clara Wiseman. Mrs. Wiseman was a kindly woman in her late 50s who left most of the demanding work of supervising the attendees to Monica. Mrs. Wiseman preferred to stay in her office, just off the main school room, where she could keep an eye on things. As Mrs. Wiseman's assistant, Monica was instructed to give only one warning to serious troublemakers. Repeat transgressors were promptly sent to Mrs. Wiseman for discipline, and that always meant a spanking. Mrs. Worthing spanked for roughhousing, disobedience, bad language, and any other offense Monica deemed sufficiently serious. As one of the more rambunctious ones, I ended up in Mrs. Wiseman's office at about every a month. After any significant misbehavior, one was instructed by Monica to go and see Mrs. Wiseman. One knocked on the office door and stood outside until Mrs. Wiseman responded. Sometimes she kept us waiting for 3 or 4 minutes, if she was on the phone or busy with papers. After one of us disappeared into her office, a relative hush usually fell over the rest of the playroom. If we were in the middle of a loud game, Monica often stopped and had us do something quiet. It was clear we were meant to hear these spankings, so that they would serve as an extra deterrent. I remember the time Billy Ryder was caught roughhousing and sent to Mrs. Wiseman. We were in the middle of reading Bible stories aloud. But when Mrs. Wiseman opened her office door and took Billy inside, Monica shut her book and announced, "Boys and girls, since we don't want Billy to miss the rest of our story, I think we'll pause here. I want you all to take out your Bible coloring books and draw quietly at your desks until I say otherwise." Even though the door to Mrs. Wiseman's office was closed, one could hear bits and pieces of normal conversation. After a brief interrogation, the naughty child was required to confess his or her misdeed. While the confession was often impossible to hear, the preliminary interrogation and the scolding which followed were quite audible. So was the distinct sound which followed of a hand spanking a bottom. I usually noted the exact moment when the child began crying, the different ways each child cried, and the way their crying changed at various stages. Many of the younger ones began whimpering or crying from the moment they were told to see Mrs. Wiseman. In hindsight, I think she liked to keep a naughty child waiting outside her office door in full view of the rest of us to add a little humiliation to the punishment. While most of them were able to hold back tears until inside her office, one often heard soft crying during the interrogation and scolding. Even that depended on the severity of the offense and the child's sense of what to expect. Anyone caught doing something really bad knew they would be spanked harder. When this happened, even some of the older ones started crying audibly as soon as they entered her office. Even when one couldn't hear any crying until the spanking, it was easy to imagine what was happening. Most of us had paid Mrs. Wiseman a number of visits over the years. And she always followed the same routine. After a brief interrogation and a confession, she scolded us thoroughly for 2 or 3 minutes. She always used a firm voice as if aware she had a larger, captive audience in the next room. And she always scolded in the following manner. "You have been very, very naughty, little boy. Do you know how Mrs. Wiseman handles bad little boys? Do you? She gives them sound spankings. And that's exactly what you're going to get in a few minutes, young man, a sound spanking on your naughty fanny. Do you understand?" No scolding ever lasted more than a few minutes. And toward the end, she would begin unfastening the boy's belt and taking down his shorts, part of our Sunday school uniform. Once these were at his ankles, she would pull him over her lap and adjust him to the best position, something which took another 30 seconds or more. If a child wasn't crying by the time his shorts were taken down, or her dress raised, most began crying audibly when put over her lap. Since we couldn't see what was happening out in the playroom, we listened for clues. Each whimper, each little protest, each quiet plea for mercy helped paint a more detailed picture. When I was sent to Mrs. Wiseman, more than anything else, the lowering of my briefs brought home the fact that a strong, non-nonsense woman was about to give me a good spanking and there was nothing I could do about it. I had the same response when spanked by other women such as my mother or Mrs. Bigwither, the nurse who handled all spankings at our school. I felt an extra surge of juvenile helplessness and dependency, as if I were still a toddler. Since I had been spanked regularly for misbehavior since I was 2, each spanking invariably triggered memories of much earlier punishments. No wonder the bearing of my bottom made me feel so naughty. Yet even while I felt terribly apprehensive, I also felt strangely safe and in an equally childish way. With my feet waving in the air and my head near the floor, I felt like I had given up control of my body to the very capable hands of an older, maternal figure who was about to teach me a lesson I had earned. Not that I wanted to learn any such lessons. Quite the contrary. Yet because I was never spanked without reason, I always understood why I was being spanked, and why it was for my own good, as I was usually reminded. Back in those days, all young ones who were bad got spanked. It was as simple as that. While some of the older ones avoided crying until Mrs. Wiseman began spanking them, every child sent broke down sooner or later. Mrs. Wiseman never stopped spanking until well after she heard genuine tears. Like my mother, she often said a good spanking began only after real crying. The first few times Mrs. Wiseman spanked me, I tried to hold out only to discover my spanking went on and on. It didn't take long to discover one could shorten the length and severity of a spanking by letting go earlier and crying freely. In any other situation, it would have been terribly embarrassing to cry within earshot of playmates. But because we all shared that fate sooner or later in Sunday school, most of us cried fairly readily. In any case, once a spanking started, one's thoughts of embarrassment soon gave way to feelings of utter helplessness and genuine repentance. Crying was the best method of venting such feelings, and seemed to make spankings a little easier to take. And I know I felt a lot better afterwards when I let go earlier. At home, I usually began crying openly as soon as mother sentenced me to a spanking. At school, all spankings were given by the nurse, Mrs. Bigwither. The teacher would call her on a special phone, and she would come collect the unhappy since her office was in the basement far from the ears of any students. I always started crying earlier when spanked at school too. By the time I walked down the stairs and down the long hallway to her office, my face was usually tear-streaked. Mrs. Bigwither always made me stand in the corner while she finished what she was doing. She never finished in less than 5 minutes. And she always used corner time afterwards as well. From the moment I entered her office until the completion of my punishment, when she called me out of the corner for a hug of reconciliation, I cried like a little boy. In some ways, I cried hardest afterwards when she held me in her arms and said things like, "We're all finished with your spanking now, sweet Daniel. You're my good little boy now, aren't you? I know you learned a good lesson over my knee, didn't you? Yes you did, yes you did. You're Mrs. Bigwither's good little boy now. And you're going to be on your best behavior so Mrs. Bigwither doesn't have to spank you again, aren't you? That's my good little boy." It's clear that spanking helped a lot, didn't it? Yes it did. If you behave like a naughty little boy again, you're going to get another spanking from Mrs. Bigwither, aren't you? Mrs. Bigwither doesn't like to spank you, but sometimes she has no choice, does she? Are you going to be a good little boy for Mrs. Bigwither from now on? At such moments, I hugged Mrs. Bigwither tightly and cried with tears of pure release as I nodded to her various remarks and questions. That was the only part of a spanking I ever liked. Fortunately, both Mrs. Wiseman and my mother also understood how important a long hug was for a naughty child after a spanking. The other reason I cried more easily than the other older boys in Sunday school stemmed from the psychological effect of being with so many younger ones. I always ended up feeling and acting 3 or 4 years younger than I was and enjoying every minute of it. I threw spitballs, played tickling games, passed mischievous notes, drew dirty pictures, tripped unsuspecting playmates, and, in short, joined in a full range of innocent mischief. As an only child, I suppose I took advantage of Sunday school and regressed a little. It was a chance to behave like a real kid, without any serious consequences, other than an occasional sore bottom. We were even dressed like young ones in Sunday school, the boys in shorts and bobby socks, the girls in white or pink blouses with little jumpers. Given this isolated, juvenile environment, it was easier to accept the more childish punishment of a spanking which others could hear. Indeed, the semi-public spankings added greatly to the childish atmosphere, and made me feel and act even more like a little boy. No wonder I cried like one when spanked. My only real complaint about Sunday school was that Mrs. Wiseman's pretty young assistant, Monica, didn't handle the discipline. As excited as I was when a child disappeared into Mrs. Worthington's office, there was a world of difference between the older woman and the beautiful Monica. From the moment Say was hired, soon after I turned 9, such thoughts became my constant preoccupation, especially since I developed an immediate crush on her. While I imagine I wasn't the Sunday school boy to imagine getting a spanking from Monica. Such thoughts quickly became the center of my fantasy life in and outside of Sunday school. The other women who spanked me, and the many who spanked me in my daydreams, all gave way in my imagination to Monica. She was much younger than my mother or Mrs. Bigwither, yet still much older than me. At that age, it was mostly felt as an overwhelming crush, which I did little to conceal in the hopes my affections, once noticed, would somehow be returned. Of course, Monica barely noticed me outside Sunday school when our paths crossed. She was grown up with her own friends and activities. But that only made me more determined to win her affection. Most of the time, I could only pine in relative solitude, catching glimpses of her from afar and occasionally enjoying the experience of passing her on the street, or in a school hallway. On Sundays, however, I had the luxury of a whole hour with the object of my affection. Needless to say, any contact or conversation with her thrilled me. Even if spankings hadn't intrigued me, I would have been thrilled when Monica scolded me. In hindsight, I'm sure I got into more mischief just to provoke attention from her, regardless of what kind of attention that might be. In my little boy imagination, I was convinced she would somehow admire my mischief as a sign of independence and cleverness. She would recognize how special I was compared to the others. She would realize how much I worshipped her and doubtless reward me with affection in return. Perhaps she would even nurse me at her breasts, which seemed even larger on such a short girl. Such are the hopes and dreams of a boy with a big crush on a pretty older girl at a time when indifference is both a huge chasm and a distance one imagines one can somehow cross. Since I knew Monica wasn't allowed to spank, I would often misbehave a little in Sunday school to draw out warnings without overstepping the fine line and earning a trip to Mrs. Wiseman. That way, I could earn at least the threat of a spanking from my beloved. She often threatened to spank you herself. Thus it wasn't hard to provoke comments like, "Daniel Richardson, you behave yourself, or I'll come over there and give you a good spanking in front of everyone." Or she might say, "Daniel Richardson, if you don't watch out, I'm going to send you to Mrs. Wiseman's office for a good spanking." By now, it should be clear why such words were both frightening and the sweetest music to my ears. Since Monica couldn't make good on her threats, I could enjoy them as wonderful possibilities rather than painful realities. There was always a delicious uncertainty, a faint possibility that Mrs. Wiseman would be sick one day, or too busy, and would allow Monica to handle the discipline for some other reason. Again, it was the sense of possibility which was so appealing. The mere fact that such threats came from an older high school girl more than strong enough to carry them out also gave them added power. So did the firmness in her voice, which suggested she would have put me over her knee in an instant had this been allowed. On a few occasions when I had been roughhousing near her, Monica had swiftly grabbed my arm, smacked my clothed bottom once, and warned me I was about to learn a very sound lesson if I kept it up. Later, I endlessly replayed the feeling of her strong grip and the impact of her hand and extended the imaginary drama into a full-blown spanking in front of the others. It was through Sunday school that my mother ended up hiring Monica to babysit for me. On one Sunday a few weeks after I turned 10, Monica caught me using a dirty word, asshole. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have said something that bad in Sunday school, but Johnny Watson hit me when no one was looking and quickly retreated beyond striking distance. In an angry moment, I told him off good in a soft whisper. Alas, Monica's sharp ears picked up the transgression, and I was immediately sent to Mrs. Wiseman's office. As always after a spanking, Mrs. Wiseman reported the matter to my mother when she came later to pick me up. Actually, she had Monica tell Mother exactly what had happened before adding an account of my spanking. All of the others had left by then, and it was just the four of us in Mrs. Wiseman's office. I found myself looking at the ground with a very red face throughout the conversation. After listening to Monica and Mrs. Wiseman, Mother said, "I want to thank both of you for responding so promptly to this kind of behavior, which Daniel knows is completely unacceptable. One of my strictest rules at home is the rule against foul language. It's even more serious to use such language in church. Daniel is going to get another sound spanking as soon as he gets home. Do you understand me, young man? You promised me last month you wouldn't use bad language again, didn't you? Apparently the spanking you got then didn't teach you to mind Mother, did it? You're going to learn another lesson, young man, just you wait. Monica and Clara, if Daniel ever uses such language again in Sunday school, I want you to spank him right in front of the others." An excellent idea, Beatrice. I'm sure a little embarrassment would help Daniel learn a good lesson. Maybe I should let Monica spank him next time. From what the mothers of the other Sunday school pupils tell me, Monica is quite capable in that department as a babysitter. Come to think of it, Clara, I've heard the same thing. And everyone tells me how well Monica handles the others at Sunday school. It just so happens that my husband and I are looking for a new babysitter since Daniel's regular sitter, Sarah Cummings, got married and moved to Houston. Monica, do you think you might be interested in sitting for Daniel a few times this coming week? Of course, Mrs. Richardson, Monica replied. I'm always happy to earn a little extra pocket money. When would you like me to show up? During my primary school years in France, there was essentially a legal gap regarding the practice of corporal punishment. It was neither authorized nor forbidden. The choice was left to the teachers, and some were pretty avid spankers. I, unfortunately, had two of them and received some of my most embarrassing spankings from them. There was something very humiliating in having to settle yourself obediently over your teacher's waiting lap in front of a whole class, then getting smacked, usually 24 stinging slaps, until you cried, even if you tried not to. The march of shame back to your seat. Sobbing and trying not to catch any of your classmates' eyes. Was really a bad moment too. However, once the correction had been administered, there usually weren't any further consequences. The only exception was if you were sent to the headmistress, where you would receive a more severe smacked bottom, and a formal note was written for your parents. Fortunately for me, for a long time Mum was under the impression that she would be warned each and every time I was smacked in school. Had she known my teachers had put me across their knee, I would have been certain of a further smacking from my mother. So through this assumption, I escaped a lot of sore bottoms at home. This run of luck abruptly ended one day when Mum came to collect me from school after our Saturday morning lessons. This was common practice in France for many years. I was enjoying a childish argument with a classmate while both our mothers chatted to each other. I was mocking my friend's recent clumsiness in a football game and said, "At least I know how to score a penalty kick." To which he immediately shot back, "Well, at least I haven't been smacked by Mrs. Lavix, like you have." I was preparing my retort to this jibe, but was cut short by my mum. She had a dark look on her face and her hands were on her hips. "Oh yes," she inquired. "Well, I'd be very interested to know when that happened." Mum didn't question my friend any further, but I had the unpleasant feeling that she wasn't finished with the subject. In the car back home, Mum remained unusually silent, while I prayed she had forgotten my classmates' unfortunate words. I was soon disappointed. Arriving home, she sent me to wait for her in my bedroom, which was the usual overture to a spanking. When Mum finally came in to see me, she was wearing her slippers, her favorite implements for chastising me, and was obviously unhappy with me. She sat on my bed and asked me why I had been smacked, as my classmate had mentioned. My answer was neither fast nor sincere enough for her. I finally confessed that I had been caught talking in class several times. At that, I was dragged roughly over Mum's lap, into the typical spanking position. Her open palm began raining down on my defenseless backside. I was thoroughly smacked and scolded for several minutes. During the spanking, Mum lectured me about the importance of my studies and the respect I should show towards my teachers. Then she suddenly stopped. For a moment, I dared hope that my spanking was over, but Mum continued to hold me firmly face down over her lap. Then she asked me, "Daniel, why didn't you tell me you had been punished in the first place?" I decided the only option was to be truthful with her. "Because I knew you would smack me too at home later." Despite my answer being very obviously the very truth, if anything it seemed to make Mum even angrier. "That was a very unwise choice you made, my boy," she said. "I'm afraid it has only made this spanking the worse for you." At that, I felt her kick off her right slipper and lean forward to pick it up. Before I could protest or plead anymore, Mum started to whack my already sore bum relentlessly with the slipper. I was crying, howling in pain, punching the air and madly kicking. Then, my correction was interrupted for the second time. Mum asked me, "Tell me, Daniel, has this also happened before?" I didn't have an answer for that, and Mum correctly took my silence as a confession. She began slippering me again, and beat me until I literally had no more tears to give. I was left like a limp rag draped over her knee, and my backside was incredibly sore. Finally, the slipper came down for a final time, and she rested it against my behind. I was shocked to notice through my throbbing buttocks that the sole of Mum's slipper was now warm from the smacking it had just administered. Mum let me up from her knee and put the slipper back on her foot. "Now, young man," she said, "you will stay in your bedroom for the rest of the weekend. And tomorrow, I will spank you again at bedtime, for deliberately hiding your school troubles. If you are smacked in school in future, I expect to be told, and you can expect the slipper every time. Do you understand?" I nodded, feeling my bottom continue to throb as I did so. I spent Sunday in my bedroom, bored, alternating between homework and reading books, and hoping with all my heart that Mum would spare me another hiding. However, that night, when I came back from brushing my teeth, I found her already seated on my bed. Her right sleeve was rolled up and the slipper was in her right hand. I was left in no doubt about what I was supposed to do. Without being told, and with tears beginning to well up in my eyes again, I obediently bent over her knee. Mum grabbed my right wrist to prevent me from covering my bottom, then gave me my second sound spanking of the weekend. After that, I never once failed to tell Mum about my school punishments, even if it invariably cost me a well-slippered bottom at home. The risk of a second helping was always enough to prevent me from forgetting to mention my misadventures again. Penelope Jameson was busy trying to close a very lucrative home sale when the phone rang. "Damn, it would have to ring when the secretary's out," she said to herself. "Jameson Realty, Mrs. Jameson speaking. May I help you?" "Good afternoon, Mrs. Jameson. This is Ms. Ames, the principal at Springville Middle School. Would it be possible for you to come down to the school this afternoon? Has something happened to Michael?" "No, as far as I know. He's fine and should be on the way home. I need to talk to you about him, though. It's important. I'm tied up in the office right now. The secretary should be back in about 20 minutes. Could I meet you when she returns? If you would, please. I'll see you then." What's the matter with Michael and school, she wondered. The call bothered her until her secretary returned and she noticed she had not completed the paperwork on the house. "Sarah, could you finish the contract on this? It needs to be ready first thing in the morning. I've got a meeting and will be gone for the rest of the afternoon." "Thank you. See you in the morning." The 15-minute drive to the school did nothing to relieve the mind of the troubled parent. Since her husband died, 3 years earlier, she had taken over the running of their real estate office. That left less time for her son than she liked. What's more, she didn't like him being a latchkey child. However, the business provided a better living than she could make as an agent working for someone else. When she arrived at the school, she went right to the office. "Mrs. Jameson. Come in, please. I'm Sheila Ames. How do you do? Would you like a cup of coffee? Please. What did you need to see me about?" Michael is a very intelligent young boy, but has become somewhat of a problem. His school work is excellent, but has become a bully toward the other children. He terrorizes the younger ones, and when he can't scare them, he fights with them. If something isn't done soon, I'm afraid I don't have a choice except to suspend or expel him. "I didn't know he was like that at school," his mother said. "I thought he was just aggressive at me because I'm at work a lot when he gets home, and work takes up some of my time at home. I've been ignoring it, or trying to compensate for my work. But I can see I need to take a stronger hand to stop this." His father would always handle him when he got out of line. "Maybe I should deal with this the same way. You can be sure he will be taken care of." "I wish I could have taken care of this myself," Ms. Ames said. "I don't like to call parents in, except as a last resort. The school board won't let us discipline youngsters, much more than keeping them after school for 30 minutes. Most of the youngsters don't mind since they can do their homework then. And the parents often yell at us, because the youngsters are late getting home. Sometimes I'd just like to give up." As the school administrator was talking, an idea flashed into Mrs. Jameson's mind. "Sheila, I have an idea I'd like you to consider. You can't discipline Mike here. I don't like him being at home alone after school and sometimes evenings and Saturdays. How would you like to have a second job? I would like you to become Michael's governess. I couldn't pay you much, but if you were willing, you could move into our house. It's much more than we need. I would know Michael was all right, and you would have a chance to help take care of the problem he's causing." Sheila thought about it for a moment. The rent savings alone would be enough, she thought. "I think we might try it on a trial basis," she said. "We'll do it as long as you would like, Sheila. If it doesn't work out, just tell me. I'm grateful that you are willing. We can start tonight if you'd like." "Fine. It's time for me to leave for the day anyway." Sheila followed Mrs. Jameson home. When they opened the door to the house, Michael was nowhere to be seen. Penelope headed for her bedroom to change, and there was Michael, just closing her jewelry box, with a $10 bill in his hand. "Just what do you think you are doing, young man? What's the big idea of taking money from my room, just like a common thief? I've been too easy on you. Ms. Ames tells me you've been acting up in school too." Michael looked up to the bedroom door and realized that his principal had walked in. "I'm sorry, Mom. I was gonna tell you." "You are not as sorry as you're going to be, young man." Mrs. Jameson grabbed a hairbrush off of her dresser. Sitting down on the bed, Penelope pulled Michael toward her. "Things are going to change around here starting now." With that, she started to loosen his belt. "Please don't, Mom. Not with Ms. Ames here." "Why not? Ms. Ames is your new governess. She's not only gonna see you're behind getting a spanking. If need be, she has my permission to do the exact same thing I'm doing now." Tugging at the young boy's, she pulled him across her lap. Raising the hairbrush, she brought it crisply across the left buttock just above the thigh. "Smark. Ow wow. Do I smark, make smark, myself smark, clear smark?" "Yes, Mom," the boy stammered out between sobs and howls. "Smark, smark, smark." The brush beat a steady tattoo of spanks alternating between the left and right sides. The room was a constant pattern of noise, shifting between the sound of wood striking flesh and the young boy's blubbering sobs and howls of pain. After what seemed like an eternity, the spanking ended. If I ever find you've taken anything from my room without my permission again, I'll take the brush to you every day for a week. Understand me? Yes, Mommy, the boy blubbered. Now, you get your nose into that corner. That spanking was for taking money out of the jewelry box. Miss Ames will deal with your school behavior before you go to bed tonight. The one thing which was forbidden was to go into the woods. Grandpa said there were wild animals in there you wouldn't want to meet, and that it would be easy for me to get lost. However, kids as we know think they know it all, and I was really curious to explore those woods. On about the third day of my stay, I got my chance. Both my grandparents were busy with indoor jobs, so I slipped out, saying I was going to play in the yard. As soon as I got outside, I went through the back gate, which gave out onto the woods, and ran in among the trees. I had a wonderful half an hour pretending I was hunting, following every small sound of creatures moving around the undergrowth. Then I realized I was lost. Really lost. I went in what I thought was the right way for home, but nothing looked familiar. I began to cry. After about 10 minutes, I heard my grandpa shouting, "Glenn! Are you out there? Glenn!" I called back and eventually, with a huge surge of relief, I saw Grandpa standing in a small clearing, and I rushed into his arms. He was just so delighted to find me. He gathered me up in his strong arms and cuddled me, then took my hand and walked me back to the house. When we got there, I was astonished to see that my grandma had obviously been crying. She also hugged me, but then stood me away from here and looked me angrily in the eye. That was an altogether stupid thing to do. Weren't you told not to go into the woods? Upstairs to your room, right now. I scuttled up the steep staircase, but before I was halfway up, I could hear my grandparents talking about my recent escapade. I was actually very rarely spanked, and then only really got my clothed, but dusted a bit with Dad's hand. It hurt a bit, but was more humiliating than painful. I had a feeling this was going to be much worse, and I was right, as it turned out. Grandma didn't waste any more words. She knew that I knew I had done wrong. She took my place on the bed and turned me to face her. "Please, Grandma," I began desperately. "You just be quiet while you can be," she said ominously. My modesty was almost immediately lost, as she firmly pulled me across her knee. Then the hairbrush went to work on my butt, and boy did it ever. Grandma covered every inch of my behind and the backs of my thighs with hard, regular spanks, which quickly had me crying. Spank, spank, spank. For quite a young boy, I think I got it pretty severely. Grandma was obviously determined that I should really learn a memorable lesson. I guess the punishment only took a few minutes, although it seemed like years that I was bottom up on her lap. I was finally allowed off, stood there in front of her, wailing hands cupping my tingling, hot cheeks. Grandma eventually hugged me. "You sit here for a few minutes and think about what you did, then you can come down for some supper," she said. Well, in truth, I didn't do much sitting that evening, at least not with any amount of comfort. What was even worse was that when my parents came to collect me, Grandma described my paddling in great detail, and showed them the hairbrush she had used. My grandpa and grandma weren't really farmers, but they had a small parcel of land at the back of their property with a few animals, which ran into dense woodland, which they harvested for fuel. When I was in my formative years, I was sent to stay with my grandparents for a few days while my mom and dad had an anniversary break. I loved staying with them because they were always so mild and easygoing. I could get away with murder compared with my home environment. Or so I thought. The other really neat thing about staying with Grandpa and Grandma was helping with feeding the animals, collecting the eggs their chickens left all about the place. I was indulged and very happy for those initial few days. My grandpa, ever the mild-mannered gentleman, said, "Maureen, I really think you should leave this to Millie to deal with." My grandmother shot back, "He needs to learn his lesson now, not in a few days' time." I didn't wait to hear any more, but scrambled into my bedroom and waited. Eventually, I heard footsteps coming slowly up the stairs, and the door of my bedroom opened. It was Grandma, and in one hand she held an oval, ebony hairbrush. She must have seen the shock register on my face, because she said, "Yes, you are going to be spanked. And spanked well. You could have been seriously hurt out there, and you need to learn to obey Grandpa and me. Stand up, young man." I did as I was told, as if this was a bad dream. I grew up in New York in the late 50s and early 60s. At a time when many African American mothers, including my own, had moved up there from the southern United States. Corporal punishment for unruly offspring was extremely common among our community. My own mom was a firm believer in the belt when the situation called for it. I also had a close friend whose mother and grandmother also belt spanked him. One day, my friend and I went to the movies and ended up staying way past the time when we were supposed to have gone home. The first thing we knew about the trouble ahead was when an usher shone a flashlight onto our seats. We looked up and saw two mothers with crossed arms and angry faces. Obviously, they were relieved we were both okay. However, we also knew we were in deep trouble. Perhaps more surprisingly, though, I was more than a little curious. The reason was that I had often imagined my friend's attractive mother spanking me across her wide lap. I sometimes wondered if she knew what I was imagining. I say this because she would often tease me about spanking my bottom. She would then laugh out loud when my face turned red. To cut a long story short, our moms decided that it would be a salutary punishment for both of us. This would be to get a spanking from the other child's mother. We were both taken back to my friend's house, where we were ordered to prepare ourselves. 2 leather belts were found, then I was summoned to my friend's mother's side. She put me firmly across her ample lap, and I was given a long, hard spanking which certainly made me wail. While this was going on, I could hear my friend crying freely as my mother dished out one of her usual efficient spankings to his own bottom. Afterward, with us two cryings, saw charge now in the room, the mothers swapped us and I was sat, gingerly, on my mom's lap. She hugged me and helped me to calm down, while my friend's mom did the same for her own son. All of my school life, I was an enthusiastic and bright student. I loved and respected my teachers, and felt respected and cared for by them as well. I was never a discipline problem at school, and could hardly imagine having to be punished by a teacher. However, one day, that all changed. Junior high was a particularly difficult time for me after my parents' nasty divorce. Several of my teachers noted a change in my behavior and attitude toward school, and fortunately for my future well-being, some of them took matters into their own hands when necessary. I found myself on the business end of a school paddle on more than one occasion. One incident involved a very motherly but strict physical education teacher, who did not hesitate to apply much-needed correction, as and when necessary. During a particularly rousing game of flag football, I made a mistake that cost my team a goal. I had a rather short fuse in those days, and did not deal with my own shortcomings very well. I threw the football to the ground, while letting loose a string of cursing that even astounded me. Everyone on the field fell into a dead silence at my outburst. Swearing was certainly not unheard of by any of us, but I had always been a quiet and subdued person. Hearing such language coming out of my mouth, and seeing that ball slam into the grass, took us all by surprise. My gym teacher scowled at me and scolded my poor sportsmanship. She then pointed to the track and sentenced me to run 4 laps of a mile. I did as I was told, letting the run blow off a lot of pent-up steam. After completing that part of my punishment, I was sent to shower early. By the time I got out of the shower, I truly felt ashamed of the way I behaved. I sat on the bench in front of my locker in my panties and t-shirt, thinking about the events of the morning. I had just made up my mind to apologize to my teacher when I saw her crook her finger at me through the huge window of her office. I made my way around my classmates, who were showering and laughing about the game we had just played. I knocked on her door and entered when called. I approached her desk filled with shame and embarrassment, not from standing there in my underwear, but because of my earlier behavior. I screwed up all of my courage and offered as sincere an apology to her as I had ever made. I admitted my guilt, my surprise at my own behavior, and promised I would never do anything like that again. She sat back in her chair and smiled at me, not in a laughing way, but in that way a trusted mentor smiles when she understands what you are trying to say. Then she proceeded to scorch my ears right off my head. She scolded my behavior, my recent attitude changes, my declining dedication, and reminded me of how much promises she saw in me, how much she respected me, and how she was not going to tolerate such poor behavior from anyone in her class. Tears welled up in my eyes and I could not do anything but nod at her stinging words. I muttered a yes, miss, or no, miss as needed, and counted the seconds before I could escape her wrath. Then she did something I had never seen her do before. She opened her desk drawer and took out a slipper. Her left hand pressed firmly into the small of my back, and she smacked that slipper into the center of my bottom, so hard I thought the top of my head was going to fly off. I gripped the desk with all my might and tried as if my life depended on it not to cry out from that first swat. 8 more swats were firmly delivered, the maximum a teacher was allowed to give. 8 more times that paddle exploded across my oh so tender and very bottom. 8 more times I gritted my teeth and latched onto the desk for dear life. 8 more times I tried to fight back tears. Fortunately for me, I failed miserably. By the 3rd swat, tears were streaming down my face, and by the 5th, I was crying freely. Her left hand pressed firmly into the small of my back, and she smacked that slipper into the center of my bottom, so hard I thought the top of my head was going to fly off. I gripped the desk with all my might and tried as if my life depended on it not to cry out from that first swat. 8 more swats were firmly delivered, the maximum a teacher was allowed to give. 8 more times that paddle exploded across my oh so tender and very bottom. 8 more times I gritted my teeth and latched onto the desk for dear life. 8 more times I tried to fight back tears. Fortunately for me, I failed miserably. By the 3rd swat, tears were streaming down my face, and by the 5th, I was crying freely. After the slippering was over, she gently lifted me from the desk. She held me in her arms, while I cried out the pain and loss the last several months of my life had brought. After a few minutes, she led me to the corner and placed my nose to the wall. She left me there until my classmates had all left, then sent me to get dressed and go to lunch. I left the gym that morning certain that the heat rising from my bottom could warm the whole city in the middle of winter. 3 days would pass before I could sit without squirming. I also left feeling very loved and cared for. I knew she understood what I was going through, and also knew she was not going to let me drown in the chaos of my life. She was only one of several teachers who adjusted my attitude via my bottom during that school year, and I will never forget the care I felt from all of them as I found my way through a very difficult and painful time. Up until a certain age, my mother would spank me over her knee with a slipper, hard enough to really make me howl. However, after that age, my parents felt I was too old for an over-the-knee slippering, so they would on very rare occasions cane me. I'd have to bend over the kitchen table, for up to 8 strokes of the cane. I know that might not sound much, but even 2 or 3 strokes would make me yell, and I'd be sore for several days. The cane was about 3 feet long and very whippy, and would leave marks right across my bottom. The last time I was caned was at the age of 18. I'd just passed my driving test when a neighbor kindly mentioned to my parents that they'd seen me going too fast in the family car. For that, I got the full 8 strokes, and not only did I yell, but I was also in tears by the end of it. However, my worst experience was about a year earlier. I'd been rude to my mother and, to be honest, deserved it, however worse was to come. The next day my girlfriend came to tea, and being beaten was not something I'd told her about. It was my secret, and was going to stay that way. I'd been out of the room for a moment, leaving her with just my younger brother, who, to make conversation, regaled her with the full story, not leaving out a stroke or a howl, nor my subsequent very audible tears. Lindy was, of course, delighted and pumped him for every last detail, which later she in turn related to all our friends. Most embarrassing. My first spanking was in junior school. The headmistress was probably a very kindly woman, but to us children she was an old dragon. I had managed to get chewing gum stuck in my hair, which was shoulder length. The more I tugged at it during playtime, the more it became firmly stuck into my scalp. Eventually, I went to the woman who supervised playtime, who marched me to the headmistress. To say she was annoyed is an understatement. Chewing gum was not allowed at school. I had to stand still for an eternity, while she sat on an upright chair in front of me, gradually combing and cutting away my hair to remove the gum, all the while telling me what a naughty, disobedient child I was. Then it was across her knee, for a very firm spanking with her hand. I had to explain the strange appearance of my hair that evening to my parents, who, though annoyed, took no further action. It was a warm summer afternoon that I'll never forget. I was down in the den, laid over my stepmom's lap. My stepmom, Julie, was about to inflict the first lash of a spanking with a doubled-up leather belt when the doorbell rang. "Don't you move. I'll be right back," Julie ordered. Seconds later, I heard 2 voices as my stepmom descended the stairs to the den on the lower level of the house. I quickly recognized the other voice as Julie's best friend and next-door neighbor Barbara. "Let me get this spanking over with Barbara, and we'll go have a cold beer," Julie told her. "I'm glad you came over. This spanking will do him more good with you present." I was already humiliated enough, and now I flinched as Barbara sat down in a chair directly across from me. Then came the first swish, as Julie laid the belt onto my rear end. Ooh, how the belt hurt as it landed over and over. Then, just as my tears started flowing, I looked over at Barbara, whose wry grin told me she was enjoying every moment of my ordeal. Finally, after the last lash had been administered, Julie allowed me to go to my room, where I was to stay until dinner. After the pain subsided somewhat, I focused back on what I had just experienced. For many weeks, I often thought about being spanked in front of Barbara again, and then the memory began fading away. Then one weekend at the end of that same summer, while my parents were away, I stayed with Barbara and her daughter Jill. We were watching TV the first evening when I started to argue with Jill about what TV program to watch. Barbara was very upset at my outburst and told me that she would tell my parents when they returned. Spontaneously, I said, "Barbara, I'm very sorry. I'm sure I'll get a spanking when my parents get back. But I'd feel better if you would do it now so we can get it over with." Barbara patted her lap and motioned me to lie across her lap. When Jill returned to find me bent over her mom's lap, she had a surprised, but pleased look on her face. The belt Jill brought was quite wide, and the sting and bite of the first few lashes really hurt. Barbara spanked me hard, and I was being sent to my room after the spanking. Tears of pain were streaming down my face. It's funny the ideas you get as a child. We were on holiday in the British seaside resort of Scarborough, and I was 4 years old. One day, as we walked along the promenade, I got it into my head to start dragging my left foot as I walked. My parents were naturally concerned. My mother took me over to a convenient nearby bench and sat me down. She took off my shoe and checked there wasn't a stone in there, then experimentally, gently rotated my ankle. I didn't cry out in pain, so she asked, "Are you all right?" I nodded. "Then why are you limping?" I shrugged. "Well, stop it." She smacked the top of my leg lightly. We resumed walking along the prom, but as soon as my mother's attention was elsewhere, I began to drag my left foot again. I found I liked the attention I was getting from other passers-by on the promenade, who looked at me with mixed expressions of amusement, puzzlement and pity. Twice more my mother caught me in the act. Twice more she sat me down and closely examined my leg and foot. It must have been extremely frustrating for her. I wasn't hurt, but yet offered no explanation as to why I was doing what I was doing. Maybe I couldn't have fully articulated my motives at that age, anyway. We set off again, and soon afterwards we passed two matronly women, who were holding ice creams and generally taking in the world. One of them said to the other in a loud voice, "Look at that poor little cripple boy there." My mother heard that all right, and she became incensed by the remark. We happened to be passing a public toilet at the time, and without hesitation, or another word, Mother marched me by the hand into the ladies and drew me into an empty cubicle, locking the door behind her. "I've had enough of your nonsense today," she hissed. I stood there. She swiftly administered around half a dozen sharp smacks to my bottom. I yelled at the first and was howling by the second. As we came out of the cubicle, the door to another one a few down opened and a lady came out to join us in washing our hands. She had evidently heard me being spanked, because she smiled and turned to my mother, asking, "Been a naughty boy, has he?" My mother was still grim-faced, as she replied to the effect that she didn't think she'd be having any more trouble that day. We came out of the toilets, and my mysterious limp had disappeared. Considering it hurt so much at the time, you may think it odd that I remember my mother's spanking spoon with such affection, but it taught me and my siblings a great deal about morals and love. Mother had many spoons in her kitchen, which were used for mixing and stirring, but one with a particularly wide head stood on the counter on its own, standing up in a little ceramic pot. This was the spanking spoon, and on it, Mother had written a Bible reference. It was Proverbs 23 verse 13, "Do not withhold discipline from a child. If you punish them with the rod, they will not die." Well, I can assure you there were times when I was over her knee that I felt I might die all right, that thing could burn a hole in your, but with absolutely no trouble, even through pants. We were very rarely spanked bottom. You had to be really naughty for Mother to decide you'd earned that, but the sting that spoon could produce was more than capable of chastising a misbehaving child, believe me, even through a couple of layers of clothing. In that respect, I think my sisters always felt they had a disadvantage to us boys when they were spanked. We were a very traditional Southern family, as you might have gathered. When we got it bottom, that's when we really feared the spoon. It stung like you'd sat down on a wasp's nest. We weren't too crazy about the humiliating aspect of having our bottoms and either, though as we were a large family, all the children born close together, we were relatively used to seeing each other's getting ready for bed etc. But there was something about the ritual of having your bottom smacked by Mother which made it a lot more embarrassing, I guess, because you were going to get a spanking once your clothing had been adjusted. This was the 1950s, and my mother commonly wore a soft cotton floral apron around the house most of the day, and I distinctly remember, when bottomed, the feeling of the warm fabric brushing against my tummy as I twisted around on her lap under the spanking. Mother was a highly efficient spanker, and she showed no mercy when it came your time to be chastised. Boy or girl, you were left with a very sore, but in floods of tears. However, There would be so much love shown after the spanking that in some ways you didn't mind so much that your bottom was on fire. Mother would sit you on her lap and cuddle you, stroking your hair, and gently talking to calm you down. If we had been given the spoon-bottomed, she would leave our underwear down for a while after the spanking and lovingly cuddle your smacked, but with her hand as you had your cry. In my junior school in the late 50s, corporal punishment was in use for various offences, by all the teachers, but the most feared punishment was to be sent to the headmistress, whose reputation and right arm were renowned far and wide. One of the clearest memories I have of her is the day that I fell off the wall. In a secluded part of the playground was a low wall, only about 18 inches high, and a favorite game was for one person to stand on the wall with his or her back to a post, and for others to try to come along the wall and dislodge the defender. Naturally, this game was forbidden, but we played it anyway. On this day, a girl called Julia was defending and I was next in line to try. Somehow Julia overbalanced me, and I fell face down onto the tarmac floor. Although I put out my hands, my face struck the floor as well as my hands and I grazed a good part of my cheek and both palms. As I cried out, a teacher came around the corner. What happened to the lookout? I don't know, and saw what had occurred. The others scattered as Julia and I were marched indoors to the office. Iodine was briskly applied to my grazes, and then we were placed outside the headmistress's office to await our fate. We were summoned in and the facts quickly established. Although Julia had pushed me off the wall, we were both adjudged equally guilty, which was fair enough. The fact that I had been injured and was in pain from that was dismissed as irrelevant. That the whole school had been warned to cease this game a week or so previously was forcefully pointed out to us, so as well as being punished for the game, we were to be punished for defiance as well. The headmistress then produced her slipper, this being a black gym shoe with a thick rubber sole, not some lightweight carpet affair, and ordered us both to bend down and touch toes. 6 or 8 hard whacks followed. We were told to rise and informed that our defiance was yet to be dealt with. We were then made to bend down again, and she then delivered about 8 further whacks to our throbbing behinds. We stood in the corner crying for an hour, were given notes for our parents, and ordered back to class. I was brought up in the 1960s, when smack bottoms, as they were called then, at least in Britain, were an acceptable and common form of punishment for naughty children. In this, I was no exception. My own smackings were always administered by my mother, and it was always the same procedure, whatever it was I had done naughty. If she decided I needed it, Mum would tell me, "Go upstairs to your bedroom and get into your pajamas ready for a smack bottom." Any pleading or promises to be a good boy were a waste of time. You just had to do as you were told, as Mum's word was law in our house. After getting out of my day clothes and sitting miserably on the edge of my bed for a while, I would eventually hear those dreaded footsteps coming up the stairs. Mum would enter my bedroom and pull out the straight-back chair, on which she placed my clean clothes for the morning. Mum would sit down on this. I'm not sure why, but prior to her preparing me, she would always pull up her skirt or dress. I would then be called over to have my pajama bottoms taken down and be put across Mum's stocking thighs. After being told what you were having a smack bottom for, the punishment itself began. It would not be long before I was kicking my legs and my pajama bottoms would fly off, leaving me near across my mum's knee and bawling like a baby, but to no avail. My mum had quite big hands and would cover every inch of my bottom and tops of thighs. Afterwards, you certainly knew you had had a smacked bum. I would have a bright red, sore bottom and be sobbing, telling Mum how sorry I was. Once she was satisfied I had been punished sufficiently, Mum would help me back on with my pajama bottoms, and then I was put to bed for a while, no matter what time of day it was. I would get a kiss on my forehead and a cuddle of forgiveness. Finally, she would say, "Mummy will call you down for dinner in a while now, be a good boy." I had finished my second year at prep school. My brother had gone off to scout camp, but I was deemed too young to join the wolf cub camp that year. Instead, I was invited to spend the first week or so of the summer holidays with a school friend, Andrew Gillingham. I got home just long enough to pick up a case of home clothes my mother had packed for me and Mrs. Gillingham, then drove me and Andrew over to their home, which wasn't very far from ours, getting there in time for lunch. It was a dismal day, with the rain coming down in sheets, so we boys were effectively confined to the house under instructions from Mrs. Gillingham to play quietly. How about a board game, perhaps? Well, we tried a board game or two, but we were looking for something more exciting than Cluedo. After a while, we had run out of 9-year-old conversation, tried cards, dominoes not really quite the thing. Then Andrew suggested Shipwrecks. The object of this game was to go round a room without touching the floor. Well, one is supposed to take off shoes and use things like magazines on the floor as stepping stones, in the polite game, but we didn't stop to think of that. Plenty of chairs, sofas, even a stoutish bookcase to cling to. We were having fun, very noisy fun, it has to be said. A couple of times, we heard Mrs. Gillingham call out, "Boys, keep that noise down," but barring a minute or two straight after such commands, we didn't really pay much heed. The crunch, literally, came when Andrew decided to get past a doorway by swinging on the door, only he swung a bit too far and crashed into a side table. Nothing was broken, thank goodness, but it made an awful racket, which brought in Mrs. Gillingham, not looking very happy. "How many times have I told you two to be quiet? Now look what you have done. Andrew, go to your room right now, and you, young man," she looked straight at me, "you stay right here. I will be down shortly." With that, she followed her son upstairs. Well, I knew I was in trouble. Big trouble, and no matter how I tried to persuade myself otherwise, I couldn't but admit I was quite as guilty as Andrew, and we had both, without a doubt, been more than a little naughty. I had never asked Andrew what happened when he was naughty at home. We knew about school, we were both hardened criminals, well used to treading the path to the housemaster's study at bedtime for 3 quick whacks of the cane, but it dawned on me that I was about to find out. I had my suspicions that it was not just a telling off heading my way. I didn't dare move from the chair that had been indicated to me, but I listened. That walk seemed like walking through treacle. It was only perhaps 3 or 4 steps, but it took a long time. Mrs. Gillingham looked at me. I was trying to look brave, but I didn't feel brave. I just wanted to get it over with, and I was dreading the lecture before the painful bit. But she just looked at me and said, "I see." Then her hands moved out, and before I knew it, my shorts were round my ankles, followed quickly by my underpants. All I could think of was how painful that slipper might be on my bottom. Have you ever had one of those moments when you realize you have just made totally the wrong decision, and it is too late to change it? Well, it was one of those moments. As Mrs. Gillingham took hold of my wrist and pulled me across her lap, she said, "Now, young man, I wasn't going to spank you, oh heck, as you are a guest, but seeing as you seem to expect it, it's only fair you got what Andrew got." With that, she pushed the tail of my shirt up, placed a hand firmly in the small of my back, and started to spank. The first smack of the slipper stung, not quite as fierce as the cane, perhaps, but it still made me start, and the second arrived before I had readied myself, followed by the rest in rapid succession. I didn't keep count. I was too busy trying to hold back the tears I could feel forming, and it seemed like that spanking was never going to stop. But then suddenly it did, and I was being lifted back on my feet, and my underpants and shorts were being pulled up, just as I couldn't hold back a sob any longer. Mrs. Gibbs marched me straight over to the sofa, sat down beside me, and put her arm round me while I gulped and sniffed and tried to stop the tears. From somewhere, she had found a clean handkerchief, certainly not from my pocket, which she used to dab at my tears. Once I had calmed down a little, she gently explained that I had been naughty, but that she wasn't really cross with me, and anyway, it was all over now. Then she leaned close and whispered in my ear. And don't worry about the tears. Andrew cried too, but don't let on you know. Somehow, that conspiratorial whisper cheered me up, and when I looked up, Mrs. Gillingham was smiling. A few minutes later, Andrew came back in the room. Both of us saw each other's tear-reddened eyes. We gave each other sheepish grins, then this time, we did play quietly until we were called into the dining room for tea. Andrew told me later that he reckoned we must have really pulled a classic one, because his mother never normally spanked that hard, or gave so many whacks. But I had a great deal of respect for that slipper after that. My next-door neighbor Linda was a single woman who had 2 teenage daughters. She was very old-fashioned in her outlook, ladylike and proper in her manner. Linda always wore beautiful house dresses, with a full skirt and petticoat, and over it she wore an apron, in which she did her housework and cooked. Every time Linda walked by I could hear her skirts make a swishing sound. I was always very fascinated by the noise, and to me the skirts she wore were so pretty and feminine. One day, I happened to be over at Linda's house helping her with something when the phone rang. Linda picked it up, and it turned out to be one of her girlfriends, a woman named Mary. Linda had been busy baking, so she put the call on speakerphone while she cleaned up. I have had an interest in spanking since an early age, so you can imagine how I felt when this conversation turned out to be mostly an account of how Mary had recently given her young daughter a tanning for being naughty. I should have really withdrawn from such a private and intimate conversation, but I lurked just around the corner of the next room and began to eavesdrop on the call. It seemed that Mary had taken her daughter Dawn shopping for a new fancy formal dress, and she had acted up in the shop, complaining about the style of her intended new clothes. She was basically running around the shop and crawling on the floor while having a tantrum. Eventually, Mary must have decided discipline was necessary. She turned her daughter around with her bottom to facing her, then smacked Dawn several times with her open hand. However, Mary had followed up the ad hoc discipline with the threat of a proper spanking when she got Dawn home. As soon as they arrived, Mary put Dawn to face the wall, to both think about her misbehavior and ponder the punishment, which would inevitably soon follow. After Dawn's new clothes were put away, Mary had gone to the dining room where her daughter was in disgrace. She removed the hairbrush she kept for spankings from the dresser, pulled out a straight-back chair, and called Dawn to her. She put her across her lap, and went to work with the hairbrush. Dawn had apparently cried loudly, as she was thoroughly spanked, and no wonder. At the end of the conversation, I overheard Linda say to Mary that she would have done the same to her own daughters if they had behaved like that. Finally, I heard the phone being placed back on the receiver. I was totally engulfed by listening to this strict mother recount in detail how she had spanked her child, and by Linda's own sympathetic and supportive responses. I didn't have much time to ponder my excitement, though, as Linda suddenly came into the room where I had been skulking and asked me directly if I had been listening into her private phone call with Mary. I decided the best course of action was to tell the truth, so I said yes. Linda looked me in the eye and said, "Well, it was very naughty of you to do that." I blushed and said, "I'm sorry, Linda." For one heart-stopping moment, I wondered whether Linda was about to look for her own hairbrush and put me over her knee, but she just said, "I should think so, too." After a few more awkward seconds, I scuttled off home. But in the years which followed, I often found myself thinking of that incident and imagining how it would have been felt to be put over Linda's ample aproned lap for a good sore bottom. My younger brother and I were brought up in a small village in England back in the 1970s. Our parents were very old-fashioned in outlook, and were also extremely strict with both of us. The discipline itself was carried out almost exclusively by mother. The environment of our upbringing was very protective, perhaps too much so. In our house, certain subjects were taboo and friendships with members of the opposite sex were strictly forbidden. By the time that I was a certain age, I was quite naturally beginning to take an interest in boys, but was however extremely innocent. Although I didn't realize it at the time, my parents deliberately tried to dissuade any interest from boys. They did this by making me wear clothes that, at best, could be described as non-provocative. Whereas other girls went around in jeans, fashionable shoes and so on, I only had plain skirts and the like to wear. Unfortunately, there was one boy in my class, Richard, who nevertheless took a fancy to me. Having discovered my address, Richard wrote me a letter. As a matter of course, my post was opened and read by my parents before I got to see it. Their reaction to the contents of the letter caused them much annoyance. I never actually got to see what was in the letter since it was destroyed. However, I was told in no uncertain terms that I was to make it clear to Richard that he was not to write or contact me again. Indeed, my parents were so concerned that I later learned they went as far as trying to get the school to move me to another class. The next day I spoke to Richard, explained the position, and obtained his assurance that he wouldn't embarrass me again. Unfortunately, though, he told one of his friends. This friend of Richard's clearly thought that it would be highly amusing to write himself. The net result was that a few days later, a second letter arrived. I arrived home from school to be greeted by a clearly highly irate mother. I was made to stand there for what seemed an age. This was, whilst my mother ranted and raved about how disobedient I had been, how I had clearly encouraged the boy, and so forth. To make matters worse, one of mother's friends had called around and sat there grim-faced. My mother's friend added the occasional comment, which only served to stoke the parental fire still further. My attempts to protest my innocence were virtually shouted down. It took mother some time before she calmed down a little. Clearly, I need to demonstrate what happens to disobedient, willful little girls like you, mother said, virtually spitting the words out in terms which I can still recall to this day. After this admonishment, she went out to the kitchen. Mother returned a few moments later with her long, slender cane. This was an instrument which she had often threatened to use, but had thus far avoided doing so. I remember feeling absolutely terrified at the sight of her, flexing the stick menacingly. "Bend over," came the inevitable instruction. Immediately I complied with this command, fearing that any hesitation would only serve to make things even worse. By this time, I was already in tears. This was only at the terrifying prospect of being caned. It was of having to endure it across the bottom with both my brother and mother's friend looking on. 6 of the best, came the pronouncement of my sentence. "And don't you dare get up before you're told to, otherwise we'll start all over again." I gritted my teeth and steeled myself for the first stroke. When it came, it felt as though I had been struck with a red-hot poker. This was accompanied by a noise that sounded as though someone had shot a gun in the room. I can remember screaming out, at the top of my voice, only just managing to avoid the natural reaction of standing up to protect myself. There was a long pause between each stroke. Mother using the opportunity to deliver a short lecture, which I was in no condition to take in. I was made to take all 6 strokes, each as venomous as the first. By the end of the caning, I was so fearful that I could hardly see. "Right, stand up, girl," came the instruction. This at least signaled that my ordeal was over, or so I thought. "The next time either of you misbehaves, it'll be 12 strokes, do you understand?" Mother announced, addressing both my brother and myself, before returning her cane to the kitchen. Although that was the end of the caning, it was far from the end of my ordeal. For the remainder of the afternoon, I was made to stand in a corner facing the wall with my hands on my head waiting for father to arrive home from work. The clear implication was that I could well find myself on the receiving end of another spanking, as mother delightfully put it, if father decided that it was necessary. With my backside still smarting from the cane, I was naturally terrified of this possibility, and it was a very long and anxious wait. Upon arriving home, Father was given a graphic description of my alleged disobedience, and what steps had been taken already. During the course of their discussion, I had to remain in the corner, quaking in my shoes. Thankfully, it was decided that I had already been dealt with adequately. Although I was to be grounded for the duration of the forthcoming half-term holiday,